This image is Morgan's. You're at ISO 200, 48 millimeters, f5.6 at 1/50th of a second. So the settings all look good. Your exposure overall looks good. We can see if we come up here, there's a little bit of area blown out on her forehead, and opposed to saying that, oh, this is an exposure where you should have backed off a little bit, I think just asking her to move slightly so that spot of light wasn't on her head would work better. Now, something I've discussed with you, but in case other people are looking at it, this image is pixelated. So I think what happened is you sized this image small, and then you resized it and made it larger. So when we're looking at this, we're not seeing the sharpness that we're used to with images, but instead it's really pixelated. Like when I say pixelated, it means like each individual pixel, you can't see them here, but they're separating, so you're missing that continuity between them. If you have more questions about that, let me know. And I know we're emailing back and forth about it, but if you want to better understand the idea of what pixelation is, let me know. All right, so the light, even though we have that little highlight on her forehead, you moved your subject to open shade. And I consistently want to be reminding students that open shade is such a great option. So if it's this bright outside and she's in the middle, you're going to have dark in the middle of the street or something. She's going to have bright highlights and dark shadows, and it's going to create a lot of like distractions by the shadows on her face that aren't necessary. So by moving her to open shade, that was a really smart decision as far as controlling the light. And then compositionally, one thing that we always talk about is if your image isn't good, get closer, right? More successful images are often closer. So this is a great example of that. You're not far away taking a picture of her standing in front of this wall. We're close and tight to her. And that's where this plasticity starts to happen. So I think if we had more clarity with this image, if we were able to see it properly sized, we would get this idea of plasticity even more, because you have this, what I'm guessing is one of these like plastic balloons that you can make out of a little tube, or they used to have those when I was a kid. And I think we'd be able to see the sharpness here and see the reflection and see the houses in the background, right? We'd be able to see all of that if this was properly sized. And then we would refocus from that reflection to her eyes, because that's where we're drawn into, and you have some nice catch light in there. We'd see the repetition of the neighborhood both here and on her eyes. So I think if we can see this properly sized, we'll really understand that this is a great example of plasticity. And it's always funny to me because students often like use something plastic in the plasticity assignment, and that's exactly what you're doing here. So I think that's fun. All right, so we can see lots of different options here. This one actually, maybe if you cropped in a little bit at the bottom, would have been a really nice image. Yeah, it looks like she's playing with bubble gum and then also playing with this like clear bubble. Yeah, I think getting closer as you did is much more successful than just having her standing there. This image is by James. You're at ISO 200, 37 millimeters, f8 at 2.5 seconds, so a really long exposure, but this is so nice and sharp. We can see each like little piece of fuzz as it's coming off of this, I'm guessing, towel. So really nice exposure here. So the settings all look good. The focus looks good. The light is coming in bright from back behind, right? And it's kind of coming through this little tunnel that you've created as you've shaped this. That's creating a lot of movement here with the light as it comes around into the darker areas and then pulls back to where the light is. You have areas that are blown out, but there are times where having blown out areas works, and this is a good example of that. The composition, like getting closer, is the number one thing that you're using here. Texture is working really well, repetition, all of those things are working really well in this image. Now, as far as plasticity, the light is what's leading us through this image and adding that sense of plasticity. So the darker areas here, and then we move back to the brighter areas, especially up in here. And as our eye kind of moves, it's like, it's not this plasticity like we had, let's say, Here, where one object comes out and another object comes out, it's kind of plasticity as we move through, like each individual piece of the texture here kind of pulls us in and out and in and out. And we move through it in a really interesting way. And that adds to some sense of depth and some sort of plasticity. Looking here, I think what you turned in is probably the strongest. I'm like turning my head as I'm looking at these because they're sideways. Yeah, I think you turned in the strongest image probably out of all of them here. All right, and then we'll look at this image by Eric. You're at ISO 250, that works, 18 millimeters, really wide, f5.6 at 1/500th of a second. So all of those settings look good. Let's see, the shoes get pretty blown out there, but otherwise I think you held on to good detail. Now, make sure you're aware of the contrast, especially if you're photographing someone with darker skin. We want, the most important thing in this image is that the skin's properly exposed, and that looks great. The shoes are really bright, so what I might do is either create a diffuser to diffuse the light as it's coming in, or maybe just get closer so that you're cropping those shoes out of there. They are a distraction. They're the brightest thing, so they pull our eye in, but that doesn't mean that you have the wrong exposure because the face looks good, and that's what we want. The light is really hard light, and as I've talked about with other images we've looked at in this critique, hard light is just always going to be difficult to photograph in, and you're going to have these bright highlights and dark shadows. So photographing this at a different time of day might have allowed for a little bit more, I don't know, softness as far as that goes, but the light on the face is really beautiful, and the hard shadow that's being created from that cheek is really nice. So I think there are some benefits to having the hard light and the shadows that creates. The composition of having the subject in the center can be a little bit stale, but here I think it works. I do think there are some distractions as we have the birdhouse, we have the houses in the background, and we have the car over here. So all of those create distractions. And this image, I think, would work a lot better if we had just taken it as a vertical image instead of a horizontal image. Then I think it's this like really interesting, character portrait. And here the houses start to be less distracting, though I would probably open up the aperture a little bit more. And remember, if you use a longer lens, your depth of field is going to be shallower. So 5.6 at 18 millimeters gives you a lot more depth of field than 5.6 at 100 millimeters, let's say. So this is a more successful image. It's more dynamic. As far as plasticity goes, if we're looking here, the plasticity, it's not really strong there. Here we kind of move between the subject and the car and the birdhouse over here, but there's not a lot of plasticity happening. There's not a lot of like movement happening in this image. So I think getting a little bit closer is the most useful thing you could do to make this image more interesting. And as far as plasticity, just think of how different colors or depth of field can help to make things feel like they're moving within the frame. If we look at your contact sheet, even here, having the leg kind of coming out more, that could work to add some plasticity to the image. Here, this is going to have some plasticity as you're having the layering there. But I think these images, like the portrait having a subject on this like cement thing, the cement structure here, I think works well. But for plasticity, I think we need a little bit more movement.